Welcome to the BioTalk Unzipped podcast, where we unzip the stories behind medical progress by sharing the latest and greatest advances in biopharmaceuticals and medical technologies in a fun, entertaining, and enlightening format. And now your co-hosts, Gregory Austin and Dr. Chad Briscoe. Hi, and welcome to BioTalk Unzipped, where we unzip, unlock, and uncover the stories behind medical progress. I'm your host, Gregory Austin in Kansas City, a life science enthusiast from the regulatory and quality compliance space. Along with me from North Carolina is my esteemed co-host, Dr. Chad Briscoe. He's a bioanalytical scientific leader and expert. And joining us on episode 9 of BioTalk Unzipped from Seattle, we have the most excellent Scott Schliebner, who will be sharing with us his expertise in drug development from a clinical and commercialization standpoint. Now, Scott is a highly strategic, innovative, commercially focused clinical drug development executive with 30 years experience across the biopharma, CRO, medtech, and nonprofit sectors. With an authentic and highly consultative approach grounded in operational expertise, Scott creates, builds, transforms, and accelerates growth for organizations. He drives commercial success through relationship building, strategic partnerships, creativity, transparency, integrity. He is passionate about patient-centric research and developing innovative approaches to accelerate clinical drug development. He's contributed to the growth of organizations like PRA Health Sciences, TFS Health Science, CGen, and others. Scott is a clinical executive, commercial strategy expert, strategic advisor, consultant, board member, patient-focused drug developer, a great professional networker, an all-around good guy. He takes people and teams and organizations further than they would otherwise go. Scott, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for the intro, and sorry for the long bio there. I don't know if I can live up to that today, but we'll give it a shot.
Absolutely.
Impressive.
It really is. We're glad you're here. And one thing that we wanted to do as a show of appreciation is to give to one of your favorite charities, which, as we know, it was called Angel Aid, is now called Rare Givers. We're going to donate $100 honorarium from BioTalk Unzipped to that organization. Can you tell us a little bit about Rare Givers and what they do?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you. That's super nice and generous of you to make a donation to them. So Rare Givers, formerly known as Angel Aid by most people, is a nonprofit based in Southern California. Originally, I think the genesis of this group grew out of caring for rare disease patients and thinking a little bit further too as we think about like patient-focused approaches. Who takes care of the patients? And we often have parents or, a lot of us who have elderly parents. We're sometimes the caregivers as well. So there's a caregiver, there's a support network behind patients and families a lot of the time. And it's easy to forget who takes care of the caregivers. And in the rare disease space, we call caregivers rare givers. So this organization does some fantastic things around mental health support and supporting those involved in the rare disease space. So it's a great cause, and appreciate you guys supporting that as well.
Absolutely. No, thanks for sharing that. That's a great organization. And I think probably just about anybody in our audience, including us, knows somebody that has had to do some type of giving, whether it's an older adult or someone going through a difficult disease period or some other type of disability. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think, Greg, we'll be able to put a link probably to their website in case anybody else wants to donate as well. So yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be great.
Yes, that will be in the show notes of both episodes 9 and 10 for sure.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah. So Scott, tell us a little bit about, what got you into the clinical side of things and what drives you in that space?
Yeah, I've been in the clinical development space for pretty much 30 years at this point. Chad and I share some gray hair. I originally, when I was an undergraduate and in graduate school, I was doing I was involved in research, but it was a little more basic in the sense that it wasn't really super applied. And while I always found myself drawn to research, the questions of, well, so what? What's the point? Does this make a difference? Does this apply to people? Kind of kept coming up for me. And I realized I needed to do something that was applicable and meaningful and had some actual application to people and could make a difference. So I found my way into the world of clinical trials, which was a great avenue of applied research and allowed me to, exercise a little bit of like scientific muscle in an area that also I thought had direct application. And for a lot of us who work in this space, clinical development, research, it's also, a legitimate care option for people, especially we touched on rare diseases earlier with the rare givers. There are so many medical conditions, indications, disease areas where there is no really approved treatment or any effective therapy at all. So clinical trials really end up becoming the only hope for patients and often a care and treatment option, right? So trying to blend healthcare and clinical research to become sort of one in a way is great. So I've loved this space. Like, again, it's been almost 30 years. I've spent a fair amount of time on both the biotech sponsor side and on the CRO biopharma services side, and just really love it.
Excellent. Excellent. So I think it's ready. It's time now to have our new news section. So we will get going with new news. New news.
New news.
New news. So today I found this very interesting. It actually came out a few days ago. It's a company, a European company called Epitomee. And what confused me, they said it's a weight loss capsule, but it's a medical device. What do you mean? What is that? So it's approved and in use. It's got the CE mark in Europe, and they've just recently filed for FDA clearance. So that is the new news part of this. So it's an actual pill, and I'll try and get a graphic on here a little bit later. You take it like a pill, and what happens is it goes into your system. The pH levels in your stomach will signal the release of this hydrogel scaffolding system that gets activated, and it blows up. It's a triangle, a little hole in it, and it's about 2.5 inches per side, and it basically fills up and flexes with the movement of your stomach and simulates the feeling of fullness and gives you that stomach will tell the brain, that your stomach is full, and it'll make you want to stop eating, right? So after a few hours, this biodegradable device will naturally break down and eliminate down the GI tract. So according to an NIH study in 2019, 52 participants lost an average of about 8.5 pounds each in about 12 weeks, and reduction in waist size by 5 centimeters. What's interesting is there's another version of this device that can send an active pharmaceutical ingredient directly to the walls of the small intestine from an expandable biodegradable device similar to the triangle, and it basically just adheres to that small intestine and delivers that API. So Scott, and I hope I'm going to try and get my camera back up here. I don't know what happened there, but from your experience, tell me, how do you see the commercialization of Epitomee playing out, and how do you see it maybe competing with products like Wegovy that has more significant side effects?
Yeah, so I've never heard of this before, so it's kind of fascinating right off the bat, right? This ingestible capsule that is technically a device, right? So if I understand, there's not an active drug in it, but it's sort of it's tricking your system into thinking that your body is full and sending a signal to your brain to maybe turn off sort of hunger cravings, right? So
Exactly.
kind of temporarily filling the space, not with food, but with something that kind of occupies it and makes us think we're full. So that's kind of fascinating, right? I have all kinds of questions. What happens to this? Does it last a certain while, and then it's biodegradable?
It lasts like 4 to 5 hours, and then it just breaks down in the system. And once it signals that breakdown, it's gone in a few minutes. But it does kind of, if I were the patient, maybe taking this device, it would kind of, I don't know, freak me out a little bit, having something sort of essentially inflate. There's no actual air because it's liquid, but inflating in your stomach, and then eliminating afterwards.
Crazy
But
idea.
it has,
I love it the way. And so off the top of my head, I mean, obviously there's a huge push in demand and interest in weight loss stuff, and we're seeing a couple products just going crazy, right? I think I heard something like Novo Nordisk's, I think they now have more money than the entire Danish country, right? So like, this little Danish biotech is kind of hit on something that is
Yeah.
Oh
really
goodness.
popular, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have concerns too, of course, as we Americans, we love just kind of popping a pill and having an easy solution and not having to kind of work on things. But I do think there's probably some risks, right, with some of those treatments,
Yeah.
and it's a little early to know
Yeah.
what the downstream effects might be. So I personally think some other kinds of solutions could be great, and maybe this creative, unique approach of Epitome is a way to um, help people with weight loss, kind of trick the system into thinking you're full, but without really like an active ingredient that there might be some side effects of. So I think there's maybe some potential upside to that. But to your point, it's hard to almost get people around. Like you almost would need like a video or a cartoon to explain
Mm-hmm.
how this works.
Yeah.
I'm envisioning
They've
a
got
consultant
that.
around this. Um, it's really different. I don't know, Chad. Have you crossed paths with anything
I,
like this in terms of a device?
No, the closest thing I've seen to this is when you go to the museum with your kids and you leave and you go to the gift shop. They have those little pills, and they I don't know if you've seen those, right?
Yeah, they
And you throw
expand
them in
up.
the bathtub and they expand
Yeah.
into an alligator or into a
Yep.
into
Yeah,
a dinosaur.
yeah,
So, but as far as devices go, no, I haven't seen anything like it. The drug delivery aspect I think is really interesting because there's so much activity around the targeted drug delivery that if you can get this, it's in the case of the drug delivery, it's almost a sleeve. So if you get that sleeve into your small intestine and it sort of pauses there and delivers a drug that otherwise, like I think the website was talking about delivering monoclonal antibodies. So if you could use it for a delivery of a monoclonal antibody into your intestine, so it bypasses the stomach, there's really some possibilities there as well. So I've definitely seen some novel drug delivery mechanisms, and it's amazing the creativity. It's kind of endless, the creativity of the drug developers to think of new ways to do this. So it'll be an interesting one to see. It's if it fizzles away or if it goes big, because you think about people who can't take the drug and because of the side effects. Do you want to do a lap band, right? Which is a pretty invasive surgery, I would think, and that external, or is this a different option for people? So yeah. Yep. It's good to have
yeah.
options. Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. What do you think, Greg? I mean, this new news. Thanks for, educating us on something you saw. What's your take on this?
I think at first it sort of concerned me. Just, the idea of just personally something going in and expanding is like, oh, is that going to block something? And what is it made out of? Those are the things, is it really biodegrading? Is it putting something else in my system? And of course there's clinical tests and they've already gotten approved in Europe. So I'm sure it's perfectly safe. And the side effects, there are some headaches, viral infections, which was kind of a question mark for me. Stomach cramping, diarrhea, and so forth. But compared to Wegovy, it's actually quite a bit less, and there's no serious adverse events. And they did lose, I think, 3 people in the 2019 study NIH did, where they dropped out because of the adverse event. So I think it's a safer way to get to the same result and provide just another option out there. I'm much more fascinated with the drug delivery side of it. I think those possibilities where you, like Chad was saying, bypassing the stomach and some of the complications there, and rather than having an injection being the only other opportunity, is you could take this pill and it would deliver it a little bit differently. So I think maybe the drug or the weight loss will kind of fund the drug delivery side of it, and we'll see how that goes. But
Yeah.
I think it
Okay.
Yeah,
has some pretty good applications.
Yeah.
super interesting.
Yeah. So Scott, you're, and I don't know if you're still, this was on your LinkedIn profile, you're still building this as a consultant, or if you've built a North American infrastructure for an EU-based MedTech-focused CRO. I was just kind of curious, when you're going through that process, can you tell me a little bit about what that looks like and how you go about it?
Sure. Yeah. So for the last, 6 months or so, I've been doing a variety of a couple different smaller fractional consulting roles, and one of them is supporting a sort of a young CEO founder, France-based organization that has developed some fantastic device experience. So medical device CRO essentially, and running studies in Europe, have a little bit of a South American and Japanese presence as well. But like a lot of firms, they realize and are aware that the US is such a huge market, right? People want to be moving here, whether it's for future investment or just working with clients or being able to run studies in the United States and Canada. North America is, I think, where a lot of companies want to be. So trying to bridge that gap of helping them build and begin a business here in North America. So some of it's, administrative infrastructure things, right? Like setting up legal entities, physical offices, things like that, the ability to do business in the United States. But a lot of it is really more people oriented, just starting to identify and bring on a couple key leaders that are open to that kind of environment, almost startup mentality of help us build something. You might need to wear a lot of hats. It might be, someone who's open to an environment that isn't all set up and structured and laid out. We actually really need to kind of create that, right? So I personally find that to be really fun and exciting, but it's not for everybody, certainly. So that's been a fun endeavor, is to help kind of build the beginnings and the foundation of a North American organization, and then also to begin to introduce and have conversations with clients around this capability that we now have in Europe and North America. So that's been one of a few things I've been doing, but that's certainly been an interesting, fun one.
Very good. Do you run into any like cultural obstacles from either just the country's culture itself or their corporate culture in trying to assimilate into sort of an American style of doing business?
Yeah, well, I feel like I've had a couple, Chad and I used to work together as well with big global organization. I think I've had a couple examples of, working in environments like that. For example, I spent a year at a Swedish-based CRO, and while the management team and the board was all Swedish, the far majority of employees lived outside of Sweden, and the far majority of clients certainly were not in Sweden at all. So there were interesting dynamics there of sort of like a Swedish board, sort of culturally believing that you should do things in a certain way, but employees are actually, I think the majority of our employees at the time were Spanish, actually, right? And so culturally quite different than Sweden. And not to mention when you look at Europe versus North America. So I think it's important, if you're going to be working in our space, so much of what we do is multinational, right? Clinical trials are
Right.
often done in more than one country, requiring people in different places. So if you're going to run global studies and you're going to run a global organization, I think you need to think a little more broadly about being inclusive and, maybe not forcing one way upon people. Certainly you can have your core values and, the ethics and the norms and the ways that you operate. But I think trying to be sensitive to the value you get with diversity, with different people from different places, different perspectives. I think it's been one of the really super fun parts about in my career. I've had the chance to work and run teams in other countries, and I think it just adds an interesting flavor. I think, Chad, I think you've had a chance to work internationally a lot too, right? We used to have a lot of
Yeah.
Dutch colleagues. Um, not that there's anything wrong with RTP North Carolina, but it's kind of interesting to, I think, to work with people with different backgrounds.
Without a doubt, and I've spent a lot of my career, with leadership roles or collaborative roles with Europe in particular. At PRA, we went over to China to look at establishing a laboratory partnership in China, and it
Mhm.
was absolutely fascinating to think about the different ways that we would collaborate and communicate and get that work done with China and doing the work in Asia. So certainly, it's certainly been a highlight of my career, I think, to have the opportunity to understand the different cultures and how they work. Very specifically, I've had a lot of experience with Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands, and those three countries, from the uninitiated, might think, oh, fairly similar. They're all kind of, get myself in trouble with some of my old colleagues if I say much more, but they're tremendously different in how they operate and just how decisions are made, how the government works and how the government influences what they do. And the size of the countries and Switzerland not being actually in the EU, is makes a difference. So and so I can only imagine if you expand, right? If you expand that beyond, that sphere of countries I've worked with, it just gets more complex and interesting for the right person. Like you said, Scott, it's not for everybody, but for the right person, it's super interesting. So yeah,
agreed. I think it's good to kind of get out of your own little perspective as well, right? And get exposed.
Sure.
Whether it's you might we used to have Chad and I used to have quite a number of colleagues in the Netherlands, and we had a clinic and a lab and a lot of interactions. And I think I'm about a quarter Dutch actually by background, and you learn pretty quickly, right? Like, I have a Dutch client on the call we're going to get started with. They're probably going to be very direct, and you're going to want to cut to the chase and get right to the point. And, if you have a call later in the day with, say, I don't know, I'm making this up a little bit, but let's say like my French colleagues with this other MedTech CRO, they may not, jump right into business. You may want to have some pleasantries and talk a little bit before you really jump into it. And I think, I think it's just fun kind of learning how different cultures operate and different sort of ways of interacting.
Absolutely. When I was in recruiting for a global organization, there were definitely some differences in just getting people on board, because they would have these contracts where it's a 1 to even 3 month period of notification. Or even if you get fired, you're like, you're fired. You can get out of here in 3 months. Although they usually leave but they get paid for that period of time. Right. And so we hired this really great medical writer, and it was July. Says, great. All right. Well, when can you start? Sometime in November. I've got vacation. Plus I've got my 3 month notice. Like, wow, that's really remarkable. Yeah.
Oh, I had just one other little quick anecdote on cross-culturalness before we jump on. So as you mentioned, I'm in Seattle. I'm on the West Coast. Pacific time zone is usually about 8 hours behind the UK and about 9 hours behind Central Europe time, depending on daylight savings and all that. So working with folks in the Central European time zone that are 9 hours ahead of me, you got to start early and everybody's got to be a little flexible. Having like the majority of our employees in the past in Spain, which is such an amazing place, and the food, the wine, the architecture, it's incredible. But work styles, right? So, the organization we worked with in Spain, there was a collective bargaining agreement that employees only work till 3 p.m. in the summer, right? It's sort of like a national law, very different than here in the U.S. So, you do the math really quick, and if I'm interacting with all my colleagues, I've got to finish interacting with them by 6 a.m. for several months of the year, right? So it makes it just really tricky, right? And there's not a lot of flexibility with that. They're like, this is how we operate, and things happen a little different in the U.S., I think.
You ever stay up till just midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, so you can catch them on the flip side?
For sure, sure. And we probably do similar stuff. Like Australia too is really a little tricky, right? And it's a little easier for me on the West Coast, but I can kind of hit you on both sides.
Yeah, for sure.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I don't think we've had a conversation that didn't somehow gravitate, if not focus, on AI, and this will be no different. So you've been developing a commercial strategy for an AI machine learning firm focused on patient retention and clinical site support. How do you see AI and machine learning really changing the clinical trial and development landscape?
Yeah, I feel like this is a topic that we're probably all going to get tired of, right? Like, AI again, in every industry we're in, right? But I think we will be no different. I think this will really be infused in so many different parts of what we do. I think there's so many opportunities, right? I think up front you have on the drug discovery sort of side of things, just the ability to maybe like screen compounds and molecules and targets and go through huge amounts of data to figure out maybe where we should be going, focusing. I think that's one area that's really great as you
So
move into.
just to touch
Yeah,
on that also, I mean, you think about an AI driven or a machine learning driven screening, we talk about screening thousands of compounds or hundreds of thousands in really massive libraries, billions, trillions,
right.
in days, right? Like,
Up there,
yeah,
right?
against every target. It's incredible. Yeah. Yeah.
The pro cons of AI, right? So we all have some
Hmm.
concerns about how could this be used in the wrong way.
Yeah.
The flip side is the positives of where you can leverage this to do things that takes us humans way too long, right? So I
Right.
think discovery stage, and then if you go further into clinical, we're generating so much data in these clinical trials, right? Clinical trials are becoming more complex each year. We collect more data points, more evaluations. You finish a clinical trial, you have a ton of data, right, on
Hmm. Hmm.
lab values and medical histories and endpoints. So I think AI plays another really nice role around being able to identify signals, maybe safety signals from a huge data set that would take a human, way too long to do. So I think whether it's generating targets or sifting through targets or identifying signals or trends, I think those are really good. On the generative side, the generative AI side is pretty cool. I'm working with a company right now that has built I don't know, my non-tech terms. I think of it like a library of, they've loaded all like 1,800 FDA guidances
Wow.
into
Okay.
a
Yeah.
language model, right? And have created a quick little FDA chat type approach where you have a question on anything in any FDA guidance, you just type it in. You know, it could be related to blood draw volume levels in pediatric patients, or what countries do I need to have consent from a child and assent from a parent, or all this information that's out there. We now have a little bit of an encyclopedia tool that allows us to really leverage all that. It's pretty amazing.
Thinking of that too, it's almost hard to think outside the box of what you can do with that AI, where you got to think non-traditionally. So you might think, oh, ask it questions. Does this comply with this? That seems really
Hmm.
straightforward. But I've found, and I wonder if in their model we could do this, but I found you can dump a spreadsheet of data in and just say, analyze this spreadsheet's data. And you get really interesting insights about trends and comparisons. And it's not a standalone. Maybe if you trained it, and had
Yeah,
standardized data,
yeah,
it
yeah.
might be, but it's not a standalone. So I'm thinking, okay, if you dumped all of the guidances in and you had done some training of the model, could you, and again, thinking from where I come from, could you dump an assay or a study like assay performance data in and just say, does this comply with the FDA guidances? Would this meet
Right.
the expectations for the regulatory validation? And then just have it see what it says. Right? Again,
See where
it's
it goes.
not it's not
Right.
it's not a standalone at this point, but you really might get some fascinating insights that
Yeah.
that that you didn't think of, right? I'm thinking about it for quality control on, and again, bioanalytical reports, maybe a couple hundred pages at the most. Clinical reports, thousands of pages.
Huge.
Just shove it in there and say, do a QC check on this whole thing,
Yeah. See what it
and
comes back with.
see what it comes back with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating,
Amazing.
amazing things
Yeah. Really
that it
cool.
can
I
do.
think
So yeah.
the ability to like weed through all the information. There's another firm I'm supporting that's created kind of an AI, a little bit more of like an analytic or intelligence tool that's able to
Hmm.
kind of, very quickly weed through all kinds of different like eligibility criteria and identify maybe, post hoc, maybe patients that really weren't eligible. And in this particular instance, it's a cell therapy, and it's like a surgical ophthalmology procedure. It's a highly complex study, and
Yeah.
like patients are like gold dust, really, and you can't really, they're really really valuable, and you need to make sure they're eligible. And you don't want to go through the process if they're not. And so you got to put a little extra sort of analytics around really making sure some of the levels of some of the prior drugs and some of the ingredients in some of the other concomitant medications don't sort of cause a problem. And some of that's hard to weed through if you're, just a regular old human being like us.
Yeah, and we might catch things the AI doesn't, but it's probably going to catch things we wouldn't as well, or maybe it would, So Scott, you've been doing a lot since we worked together, but I wanted to dive into where I knew you best, and clearly your passion is still there with rare diseases. I mean, I don't think that's something that ever leaves you, but I've got a whole series of things I really want to dive into in this rare disease space, but first, I'd really for those that have not been exposed to rare diseases, can you just tell me a little bit about how rare disease trials, and this is a big question, so do your best to package it up, but how are rare disease trials really different from, I'll call them the run-of-the-mill trials? I don't if any trial is really run-of-the-mill, but just talk a little bit about that rare disease trial space in general.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's a good starting point too. I think so those of us who work in clinical development know that clinical trials are certainly a trial, because a lot of times, it's hard to predict where it's going to go, and, managing and operationalizing all that, it's not always smooth sailing. There's all kinds of surprises, right? It could be regulatory or data or logistics or whatever it is. And I think when you design and run a study in a rare disease, and rare diseases are certainly not all the same. There's a huge spectrum ranging from fairly common rare to ultra rare or highly complex or genetic, occurring in kids. And there's a range of different rare, but just to sort of group them all together and just call them rare for a second, there's a whole really bevy of different complications and things that become more challenging when you go into those spaces above and beyond a regular trial, like, a topical cream for acne or something, right? Like a pretty straightforward, easy thing to do. When you move into rare, you start to move into, a couple off the top of my head, like 4 or 5 key things I think are, well, by definition, the patients are few and far between, right?
Right.
They're rare, right? We define rare as based on prevalence, and like the US, EU, and Japan all have slightly different definitions, but by and large, we're talking about not a lot of patients. So what does that mean? That means that, well, number one, they're not all, clustered around academic medical centers and cities necessarily. So connecting and finding and enrolling patients is hard. From like an individual physician perspective, because patients are rare, even big thought leaders and KOLs in a particular disease area might only see like 2 patients a year with that particular disease, right? So there's not a lot of volume. There's not a lot of exposure. The symbol for rare diseases, as you may know, is a zebra, right? And the zebra with its stripes, the reason the zebra is the symbol is because way back in the 50s, there was a famous physician who was training med school students, and he had this mantra that we repeat in other areas right now, which was something to the effect of, if you hear hoofbeats, it's probably a horse. His thought was kind of like Occam's razor, like the simplest solution. Don't overthink it, right? If you hear what sounds like a horse, it's probably a horse. Most of the time it will be, right? So we went forward with that premise starting in the 50s. And, the rare disease community is very, quick to speak out, as they should. Hold on a second. You hear hoofbeats, it's probably a zebra 10% of the time, right? So don't jump to that horse diagnosis right away. So the point of that, of course, is like physicians, we know that a lot of them are way too busy. They're required to see crazy patient loads. Payers and insurance demand so much. They might have to quickly move through a diagnosis or something, and they're not thinking about the zebra necessarily that much, right? They're thinking about the horse 9 out of 10 times. So you end up with a complication there around, not a lot of these patients are out there. And there's also this, what's called like the diagnostic journey for patients, where you may go through a lot of physicians and healthcare systems before somebody figures out really what you have, because no one really sees this much. So that adds a whole nother level of complexity. So you've got few and far between patients, which creates logistical problems. How do you get them to a clinical site or get a clinical trial to them? A lot of these diseases are multidisciplinary. You may have to interact with a neurologist and a pediatrician and an endocrinologist to sort of care, or even within the conduct of a clinical trial. So challenges there. And then we do have a lot of pediatric patients, right? So going back to the rare givers, you have kind of a care team and a care family, right? You may have an aunt and an uncle and a mom and a dad involved, and you may have like multiple physicians. So it kind of creates a little bit more of a complex ecosystem in a lot of ways. So, conducting clinical trials has to sort of navigate all these what do we call them? Pitfalls, potholes, landmines, whatever they are.
Yeah, none of them sound like the right word, but everybody knows what you're saying.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of BioTalk Unzipped. Catch us next time for part 2 with Scott Schliebner. See you soon. Take care.